Every morning, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, Harold Mitchell followed the same routine he had kept for the past 15 years. At exactly 7 a.m., the 93-year-old veteran would carefully park his well-maintained 1985 Buick LeSabre in front of Pete's Diner. The car, like its owner, showed its age but carried itself with dignity. The bell above the diner's door chimed as Harold pushed it open, using his wooden cane more for balance than support. The familiar smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, making him smile. Sarah, the morning waitress who had worked there for over a decade, already had his usual table ready, the third booth from the door, which gave him a clear view of both the entrance and his parked car. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Sarah called out, holding his special coffee mug. It was a simple white cup with a Marine Corps emblem that his daughter had given him years ago. The handle had a small chip, but Harold refused to use any other mug. "The usual breakfast today." Harold nodded, carefully settling into his booth. His movements were slow but purposeful, earned from years of military discipline and age. "Yes, please, Sarah. And maybe an extra slice of toast today." His voice, though aged, still carried the clear, commanding tone of a former Marine sergeant. The diner was quiet at this hour, just the way Harold liked it. A few regular customers nodded in his direction. Mr. Peterson, the local hardware store owner, and Mrs. Thompson, who taught at the elementary school. They all knew Harold and respected the quiet dignity he brought to his corner of the diner. As Harold sipped his coffee, his mind wandered to the old days. The walls of Pete's Diner were decorated with photos of the town's history, including one black-and-white picture from 1945 that showed the original diner. Harold had been there when that photo was taken, just after returning from the Pacific. He was barely visible in the background, young and proud in his Marine uniform. The peaceful morning routine was suddenly interrupted by the loud rumble of motorcycle engines. The sound made Harold's coffee ripple in its cup, and he looked up to see several large bikes pulling into the parking lot. This was something new. Pete's Diner didn't usually attract the biker crowd. Through the window, Harold watched as 5 men dismounted their motorcycles. They were dressed in leather jackets covered in patches, their boots heavy on the pavement. The youngest looked to be in his 20s, while their leader appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a thick beard and tattooed arms. As they entered the diner, the quiet atmosphere changed immediately. Their voices were loud, their laughter boisterous, and their presence seemed to fill the small space. They chose the tables near Harold, spreading out and calling orders to Sarah, who looked slightly uncomfortable with their demanding tone. Harold continued eating his breakfast quietly, but he couldn't help noticing the occasional glances and smirks thrown his way. He heard one of them whisper something about old-timer and dinosaur, followed by muffled laughter. In his younger days, such remarks might have sparked his temper, but age had taught him patience. Sarah noticed the tension and tried to create a buffer, refilling Harold's coffee more frequently than usual and positioning herself between his table and the bikers when possible. Her protective instinct touched Harold. She reminded him of the nurses who had cared for his fellow Marines in the field hospitals. As Harold finished his breakfast, he could hear the bikers planning to make Pete's Diner their regular morning spot. His hand tightened slightly around his cane, but his face remained calm. In his 93 years, he had faced far worse than a group of discourteous bikers. Still, as he prepared to leave, carefully counting out his bill plus his usual generous tip for Sarah, he couldn't help but wonder if his peaceful morning routine was about to change. The bell chimed again as Harold pushed open the door, the sound nearly drowned out by another burst of laughter from the bikers' tables. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows of the motorcycles across the parking lot. Harold made his way to his car, his cane tapping quietly against the pavement, already thinking about tomorrow and whether his beloved diner would still feel like the peaceful haven it had been for all these years. The next few days brought unwelcome changes to Pete's Diner. Harold tried to maintain his usual schedule, but each morning, the bikers arrived earlier. They seemed to take special interest in making the old veteran uncomfortable, their actions becoming bolder with each passing day. On this particular morning, Harold noticed something different as he pulled into the parking lot. The bikers had parked their motorcycles in a way that left only a narrow space near the dumpsters. Harold had to make 3 careful attempts to park his Buick, his aged hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Through the diner's windows, he could see the bikers watching and laughing. Inside, Sarah greeted him with worried eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, I can ask them to move their bikes, she whispered, setting down his coffee mug with shaking hands. But Harold shook his head. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a complaint. Mike, the bearded leader of the bikers, stood up and walked over to Harold's booth. His heavy boots echoed on the tile floor, and the diner grew quiet. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed to fade away. "Hey, old-timer," Mike said, placing his tattooed hands on Harold's table. "You seem to be having trouble parking that ancient car of yours. Maybe it's time to give up driving?" Harold took a slow sip of his coffee, his blue eyes steady as he looked up at Mike. The veteran's silence seemed to irritate the biker even more. The other customers watched nervously, with Mr. Peterson half rising from his seat, ready to intervene. "What's wrong, Gramps? Lost your hearing aid?" One of the younger bikers called out, causing the group to burst into laughter. Sarah, who was bringing Harold's breakfast, set the plate down with more force than necessary, splashing some coffee on the table. "I can hear just fine, young man," Harold finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I can also see just fine. I see 5 grown men who seem to have forgotten the basic manners their mothers must have taught them." His words carried across the quiet diner, making some of the younger bikers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mike's face reddened. He reached out and picked up Harold's Marine Corps mug, pretending to examine it. "Nice cup you got here, old-timer. Military man, huh? Bet those days are long gone." He set the mug down carelessly, causing coffee to slosh over the sides. Harold carefully wiped the spilled coffee with a napkin, his movements deliberate and controlled. The silver ring on his right hand, a Marine Corps ring he'd worn since 1945, caught the morning light. "Some things," he said quietly, "never go away, son, including respect for others." The tension in the diner was broken by the arrival of more customers. Mike rejoined his group, but not before giving Harold a long, threatening look. The bikers continued their meal, occasionally throwing balled-up napkins in Harold's direction when Sarah wasn't looking. As Harold finished his breakfast, he noticed something that worried him more than the bikers' behavior. Some of the regular customers, including families with children, were choosing to sit far from his usual corner. His presence was now drawing unwanted attention to this section of the diner. Outside, Harold found his car had been boxed in even more tightly by 2 additional motorcycles. It took him nearly 15 minutes to maneuver out of the space, each turn of the wheel accompanied by jeers from the bikers watching through the window. But Harold kept his face neutral, showing no sign of the frustration he felt. As he drove home, Harold thought about his options. He could find another diner, one where he wouldn't have to deal with harassment. He could change his schedule to avoid the bikers. But something in him, the same spirit that had carried him through the beaches of the Pacific, refused to be chased away. That evening, as Harold sat in his favorite armchair, he looked at an old photograph on his wall. It showed him standing proud beside a military motorcycle, surrounded by his unit. His fingers traced the glass over the image, and a small smile crossed his face. These young bikers had no idea who they were dealing with, but soon they would learn that this old veteran had more than a few surprises left in him. A week had passed since the bikers first appeared at Pete's diner, and the situation was getting worse. On this cold morning, Harold adjusted his veteran cap, the one that displayed his Marine Corps service with pride. It was a special day, the anniversary of his unit's most important mission in the Pacific. He always wore his full veteran gear on this date. When Harold pulled into the parking lot, he noticed more motorcycles than usual. 3 new bikers had joined Mike's group, their leather jackets bearing the same gang patches. As Harold stepped out of his car, he heard one of them whisper, "Look at the old man playing dress-up soldier." Inside the diner, Sarah's face showed instant concern when she saw Harold in his veteran cap and jacket with service medals. She knew how much these symbols meant to him, and she could sense trouble coming. "Maybe sit at the counter today, Mr. Mitchell," she suggested quietly. But Harold shook his head and walked to his usual booth. The bikers were already watching him, their morning entertainment about to begin. Mike stood up, holding his coffee cup, and walked over to Harold's table. His heavy boots seemed to strike the floor harder than necessary with each step. Well, Mike announced loudly. "Looks like Grandpa's going to a costume party." The other bikers laughed on cue. "Nice hat you got there, old-timer. Did they even have real wars back in your day, or was it all just marching practice?" Harold remained silent, arranging his napkin on his lap with steady hands. His calm seemed to frustrate Mike even more. The biker leader reached out and flicked the brim of Harold's veteran cap. I said, "Nice hat." Mike repeated, his voice harder now. "You know, my buddies and I ride real machines. Not like those toy motorcycles they probably had you on back then." The diner had gone completely silent. Even the cook had stepped out from the kitchen, a spatula gripped tightly in his hand. Sarah stood frozen by the coffee maker, her hand trembling as she held the pot. Mike picked up Harold's Marine Corps mug and pretended to examine it. "You probably just bought this at some army surplus store, right? Trying to get free meals and respect you didn't earn?" That's when it happened. As Mike carelessly swung the mug around while talking, hot coffee splashed across Harold's veteran jacket, staining the medals he had earned with blood and sacrifice. The old veteran's eyes flashed with a fire that no one in the diner had ever seen before. Harold slowly stood up, his back straight as a flagpole. Despite his age, he seemed to tower over Mike. When he spoke, his voice carried the command of his sergeant days, filling the entire diner. "Young man," Harold said, each word clear and sharp, "you've just crossed a line you can't uncross." His hands, still steady, carefully wiped the coffee from his medals. "These aren't costumes. These aren't toys. And I didn't buy them at any store." Mike took a step back, surprised by the sudden change in the old man's demeanor. The other bikers shifted in their seats, the laughter gone from their faces. "Each of these medals," Harold continued, his voice getting stronger, "tells a story of sacrifice. Stories you couldn't begin to understand. And that toy motorcycle you mentioned? I rode one through enemy fire to save 16 men, including one whose grandson might interest you greatly." The diner remained silent, but now it was a different kind of silence, one filled with tension and anticipation. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. His hands, which had remained steady through all the harassment, now trembled slightly as he held it. "Tomorrow morning," Harold said, looking directly into Mike's eyes, "I'll be here at my usual time, and I'm going to tell you a story about a young Marine motorcycle scout who made a choice that changed many lives. Whether you choose to hear it or not will tell me everything I need to know about you." With that, Harold placed a few dollars on the table for Sarah, picked up his coffee-stained cap, and walked out of the diner with his head held high. Through the window, the stunned bikers watched as the old veteran got into his car and drove away, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken questions and the first seeds of respect. The next morning arrived with dark clouds hanging over the town. Harold sat in his parked Buick outside Pete's diner, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The parking lot was already full of motorcycles, more than usual. The old photograph he had promised to bring lay carefully folded in his breast pocket. Inside his car, Harold checked his appearance in the rearview mirror. He had chosen to wear his full veteran uniform today, every medal polished and in place. The coffee stains from yesterday were gone. He had spent 3 hours carefully cleaning each medal the night before. As Harold stepped out of his car, the rumble of motorcycles grew louder. More bikers were arriving, forming a circle around him in the parking lot. He counted 12 bikes now, their engines revving aggressively. Mike sat on his motorcycle at the front of the group, his face unreadable behind dark sunglasses. Sarah watched anxiously from the diner window, holding a phone ready to call for help. Other customers stood beside her, including Mr. Peterson and several regular morning visitors. They had all arrived early, sensing something important was about to happen. Mike dismounted his bike and walked toward Harold. The other bikers followed, creating a tight circle around the old veteran. Their leather jackets creaked as they moved, and their boots scraped against the asphalt. The morning sun had not yet risen, and the shadows looked long and threatening in the dim light. "You said you had a story to tell," Mike said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "But first, let's see if you're as brave without your usual audience." He gestured toward the diner, where worried faces pressed against the windows. Harold stood perfectly still, his cane planted firmly on the ground. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong. "Before I tell my story, I want you all to look at something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, holding it carefully by its edges. The photograph showed a group of young Marines standing beside their motorcycles. They wore dirty uniforms and tired smiles. In the center stood a younger Harold, his arm around another Marine who looked remarkably like Mike. "This photo was taken on August 15, 1945, Harold said. just after we completed our most dangerous mission. We were motorcycle scouts, riding through enemy territory to deliver critical information. He paused, looking directly at Mike. The man standing next to me in this photo is Thomas Anderson. Does that name mean anything to you? Mike's face suddenly lost its color. He stepped forward, grabbing the photograph with shaking hands. That's my grandfather, he whispered. The other bikers moved closer, their aggressive stance forgotten as they tried to see the old photo. Harold continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. Tom Anderson was the bravest man I ever knew. He rode beside me the day we had to get through enemy lines to warn our advancing troops about a hidden artillery position. When my bike took a hit, he came back for me under heavy fire. Harold's eyes never left Mike's face. Your grandfather saved my life that day, son. Mike's hands were trembling as he held the photograph. The other bikers had fallen completely silent, their engines now quiet. The morning air felt heavy with history and unspoken emotions. My grandfather. He used to tell stories about his sergeant from the war, Mike said slowly. He said his sergeant was the finest man he ever served with. A man who led from the front and never left anyone behind. He looked up at Harold, really seeing him for the first time. He was talking about you, wasn't he? Harold nodded slowly. Tom wrote to me every year until he passed. He told me about his children and about his grandson who loved motorcycles just like he did. He reached out and placed a steady hand on Mike's shoulder. He would have been proud to see you riding, son, but not proud of how you've been acting. The silence in the parking lot was broken only by the sound of distant traffic and the gentle morning breeze. The circle of bikers had transformed from a threatening gang into a group of men facing their own shame and respect for a history they hadn't known they shared. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across Pete's diner parking lot. Mike stood frozen, still holding the old photograph of his grandfather and Harold. The other bikers had gathered closer, their earlier hostility replaced by a mix of shame and curiosity. Sarah and the other customers watched from inside as Mike suddenly removed his leather jacket. Underneath, he wore a faded T-shirt with a Marine Corps logo, the same one his grandfather had given him years ago. Sergeant Mitchell, he said, using Harold's military title for the first time, would you join us inside? I think we all need to hear more about my grandfather. Harold nodded, and the group of bikers parted to make way for him. This time, instead of mocking his slow walk with the cane, two of the younger bikers moved to help him. Harold politely declined their help but appreciated the gesture. As they walked toward the diner, Mike carefully carried the precious photograph. Inside, the regular customers watched in amazement as the bikers respectfully arranged chairs around Harold's usual booth. Sarah hurried over with Harold's special Marine Corps mug, freshly washed and filled with hot coffee. This time, Mike waited for Harold to sit first before taking his own seat. Tell us about the mission, Sergeant, Mike said quietly, placing the photograph gently on the table. Tell us about my grandfather. The other bikers leaned in, their faces showing genuine interest. Harold took a sip of his coffee and began his story. It was the summer of 1945. Your grandfather and I were part of a special motorcycle scout unit. We rode modified Harley-Davidson WLAs, not as powerful as your bikes today, but they got the job done. He pointed to the motorcycles in the photograph. These machines saved countless lives. We used them to carry messages, scout enemy positions, and sometimes... Harold paused, his eyes distant with memory, sometimes to draw enemy fire away from our advancing troops. Mike's hands clenched on the table. Grandpa never talked much about the dangerous parts. He would only say that his sergeant always led the way. Harold nodded slowly. That's because Tom, your grandfather, was too modest. He never told you about the day he earned his Silver Star, did he? When Mike shook his head, Harold continued. We were pinned down by enemy fire. 3 of our bikes had been hit. Tom rode back and forth, drawing their fire while helping the wounded get to safety. The diner had fallen completely silent. Even the cook had stepped out from the kitchen to listen. Sarah quietly refilled coffee cups as Harold spoke, her eyes glistening with tears. Your grandfather wrote to me every Christmas, Harold said, pulling out a worn envelope from his jacket. His last letter arrived just before he passed. He wrote about you, Mike, about how proud he was that you had found your own brotherhood on 2 wheels. Mike wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. One of the older bikers placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. I had no idea, Mike said, his voice rough with emotion. All this time, we've been disrespecting a man my grandfather loved like a brother. Harold reached across the table and patted Mike's hand. Your grandfather would understand. Young men sometimes need to learn respect the hard way. And I certainly did, back in our day. The atmosphere in the diner had completely transformed. Regular customers who had been avoiding the bikers now watched with warm smiles as these tough-looking men listened to Harold with rapt attention. Mr. Peterson quietly ordered breakfast for everyone, and Sarah began serving plates of food. Sergeant Mitchell, Mike said suddenly, standing up. On behalf of my grandfather and all of us here, I want to apologize for how we've treated you. The other bikers stood as well, forming a respectful circle around Harold's booth. Harold looked at each face, seeing now not troublemakers, but young men searching for their own path, just as he and Tom had been so many years ago. He carefully folded the photograph and handed it to Mike. Keep this, he said softly. Let it remind you of the man your grandfather was, and the man he hoped he would become. The next few weeks brought remarkable changes to Pete's diner. Every morning, instead of the sound of threatening motorcycle engines, the parking lot filled with the respectful arrival of Mike and his fellow bikers. They had made it their mission to arrive before Harold, ensuring his parking spot was always clear and waiting. On this particular morning, Harold arrived to find Mike and 3 other bikers standing beside his usual parking space. The spring sun glinted off their polished motorcycles, which were now parked neatly in a row, leaving plenty of room for other customers. As Harold's Buick approached, Mike stepped forward with a warm smile. Good morning, Sergeant Mitchell, Mike called out, opening Harold's car door for him. He had stopped wearing his intimidating dark glasses, and his face showed genuine respect. We got something special to show you today. Harold stepped out of his car, noticing that the bikers were all wearing clean, pressed clothes instead of their usual leather jackets. Something was definitely different about this morning. Sarah watched from the diner window with a knowing smile. First, Mike said, we want you to see what we did with the photograph you gave me. He led Harold to his motorcycle, where a small, weatherproof case had been mounted on the fuel tank. Inside, carefully protected, was the photograph of young Harold and Mike's grandfather. Next to it was a small plaque that read, in honor of the original motorcycle scouts, World War II Pacific Theater. Harold's eyes moistened as he read the plaque. You didn't have to do this, son, he said quietly. That's not all, one of the younger bikers, Tommy, spoke up. Show him the jackets, Mike. Mike nodded and walked to his bike's saddlebag. He pulled out a leather jacket, but it wasn't their usual gang jacket. This one was different. On the back was a newly designed patch showing a World War II military motorcycle with the words Mitchell's Scouts, honoring our veterans, circling it. We changed the name of our group, Mike explained, his voice full of pride. No more gang stuff. We're now a veterans support riding club. Every member has pledged to help local veterans, just like you taught us about brotherhood and respect. Harold ran his hand over the patch, feeling the carefully stitched details. The motorcycle in the design was exactly like the one he had ridden in the war. How did you get it so accurate? He asked. Tommy stepped forward. We found old military photos and documents. Been studying them for weeks to get it right. We wanted to honor you and all the brave motorcycle scouts properly. Just then, Sarah came out of the diner carrying Harold's Marine Corps mug. But today she wasn't alone. Behind her, a line of diner staff emerged, each carrying trays of breakfast. The regular customers followed, and Harold noticed they were all wearing small pins with the same motorcycle scout design. The whole town's behind this, Sergeant, Mike explained. When people heard about your story and what you and my grandfather did in the war, they wanted to be part of honoring that legacy. The diner's parking lot had become an impromptu gathering place. Mr. Peterson had set up tables outside, and Mrs. Thompson from the elementary school was there with some of her students, who had made thank you cards for Harold. But there's one more surprise, Mike said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box and opened it carefully. Inside was a silver pin, exactly like the ones everyone was wearing, but this one was different. It had been made from metal taken from a restored World War II military motorcycle. We want you to have the first one, Sergeant Mitchell. And, Mike paused, looking slightly nervous, we'd be honored if you would be our club's honorary president. Harold stood quietly, taking in the scene around him. Just weeks ago, this same parking lot had been a place of tension and disrespect. Now it was filled with people brought together by understanding and honor. The transformation wasn't just in the bikers or the diner, it was in the whole community. With steady hands, Harold picked up the silver pin. Tom would be proud, he said softly, looking at Mike. He'd be proud of all of you. 1 month after the bikers changed their name to Mitchell's Scouts, Pete's Diner had become more than just a breakfast spot. Every morning, the parking lot filled with a mix of motorcycles and regular cars, their owners all gathering to hear Harold's stories over coffee and breakfast. On this particular morning, Harold arrived to find the diner decorated with red, white, and blue streamers. A hand-painted banner hung across the front window reading Veterans Appreciation Day. Mike stood at the door, wearing the new club jacket with pride, greeting every arrival with a warm handshake. "Good morning, Sergeant Mitchell," Mike called out as Harold parked his car in his usual spot, now marked with a small sign reading, "Reserved for our hero." The old veteran noticed more bikes than usual in the lot, many bearing license plates from neighboring towns. As Harold walked toward the diner, he saw something that made him stop in surprise. A line of children from Mrs. Thompson's class stood along the path, each holding a small American flag. They had been practicing for this moment all week. "Welcome, Sergeant Mitchell," they said in unison, waving their flags. One little girl stepped forward, holding a large card. "We learned about motorcycle scouts in history class," she said proudly. "You're in our textbook now." Inside the diner, Sarah had outdone herself. Every table was decorated with mini American flags, and the walls were covered with enlarged copies of wartime photographs showing motorcycle scouts in action. Harold's usual booth had been specially decorated with Marine Corps emblems and a small plaque. "This isn't just about me anymore," Harold said to Mike as they walked in. "Look at what you've all created." He gestured to the crowded diner, where veterans from different eras sat sharing stories with the bikers and regular customers. Tommy, the young biker who had helped design their new patch, stood up and called for everyone's attention. "We have something special to announce," he said, his voice carrying across the busy diner. "Thanks to Sergeant Mitchell's inspiration, Mitchell Scouts has started chapters in 5 other towns. We're now helping veterans all across the state." The diner erupted in applause. Mr. Peterson stood up next, holding a newspaper. "And that's not all," he added. "The local paper ran a story about our group. It's been picked up by national news. People everywhere are learning about the motorcycle scouts and their legacy." Harold sat in his booth, overwhelmed by the attention. Sarah brought him his special Marine Corps mug, now joined by dozens of similar mugs at other tables. The bikers had ordered them for all their members. Mike pulled up a chair next to Harold's booth. "Remember when we first met?" he asked quietly. "We were just troublemakers looking for someone to bother. Now look at us." He pointed to a group of bikers helping an elderly veteran with his walker. "You didn't just teach us about respect, Sergeant. You showed us how to be better men." The door chimed as more people entered the diner. A group of veterans from the local VA hospital arrived, escorted by Mitchell's Scouts members. They had heard about the special breakfast and wanted to be part of it. Mrs. Thompson stood up, holding a small book. "We've been collecting everyone's stories," she explained. "Veterans, family members, even the children's letters. It's becoming a real history of our community." Harold looked around the busy diner. Where once there had been division and disrespect, now there was unity and understanding. The bikers who had once threatened him were now protectors of veterans' dignity. The community that had watched in worry now gathered in celebration. "Your grandfather," Harold said to Mike, his voice soft with emotion, "wrote to me once about legacy. He said it wasn't about medals or missions. It was about the lives we touch and the changes we inspire." He patted Mike's hand. "Look around, son. This is what legacy looks like." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, illuminating the faces of young and old, bikers and veterans, all brought together by one man's quiet dignity and another's journey to understanding. 1 year had passed since the day Harold first confronted the bikers in Pete's Diner's parking lot. The small diner had transformed into something remarkable, a gathering place where veterans shared their stories and found support from an unlikely brotherhood of bikers. On this special morning, Harold sat in his usual booth, but something was different. The diner was packed with people from all over the state. Mitchell's Scouts members, now numbering over 200, filled the parking lot with their motorcycles. Each bike proudly displayed the Scout emblem, and many carried American flags. Mike stood at the front of the diner, looking nervous in a clean-pressed suit instead of his usual riding gear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "We're here today to celebrate something amazing. Thanks to Sergeant Mitchell's inspiration, Mitchell's Scouts has now helped over 1,000 veterans across the country." The crowd applauded as Mike continued. "But that's not all we're celebrating." He turned to Harold. "Sergeant, would you join me up here?" Harold walked to the front, his cane now decorated with Marine Corps ribbons, a gift from the bikers. The morning sun through the windows caught the silver pin on his jacket, the one made from the World War II motorcycle metal. "1 year ago," Mike said, addressing the crowd, "this man taught us about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of brotherhood. Today, we're proud to announce that Mitchell's Scouts has been officially recognized as a National Veterans Support Organization." Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a large cake decorated with the motorcycle Scout emblem. Behind her, Mr. Peterson wheeled in something covered with a cloth. Mrs. Thompson's students lined up near the door, each holding photographs showing the year's activities. Bikers helping veterans with home repairs, escorting them to medical appointments, and organizing memorial services. "Sergeant Mitchell," Mike said, turning to Harold, "we have something to show you." He nodded to Mr. Peterson, who pulled away the cloth to reveal a beautiful glass display case. Inside was Harold's original Marine Corps jacket, the one that had been stained with coffee that fateful day. Next to it hung Mike's grandfather's photograph, and below them both sat a brand new leather jacket with a special patch reading "Honorary Founder, Mitchell's Scouts." Harold's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the display. Tommy stepped forward with more news. "The VA has asked us to establish chapters at every major veterans hospital in the country," he announced proudly. "They say our program of connecting veterans with motorcycle escorts and support has made a real difference." Sarah brought Harold his morning coffee in a new mug, solid silver with the Marine Corps and Mitchell's Scouts emblems engraved side by side. "This diner will always be your home," she said softly, "but now it's home to so many others too." The little girl who had first welcomed Harold with a flag months ago now presented him with a thick book. "We collected stories from everyone you've helped," she explained. "It's called The Scout's Honor: How One Man's Courage Changed a Nation." Harold opened the book to find pages filled with photographs, letters, and stories. There were images of bikers helping veterans, newspaper clippings about their work, and countless thank you notes from families they'd supported. "Your grandfather once told me," Harold said to Mike, his voice strong despite his emotion, "that the true measure of a man isn't in the battles he fights, but in the lives he touches." He looked around at the packed diner. "I never imagined that a morning cup of coffee could lead to all this." Mike placed his hand on Harold's shoulder. "You showed us that it's never too late to learn respect, and never too early to start showing it. Every time we help a veteran, we honor your legacy." The morning sun filled the diner with warm light as Harold looked at the faces around him, bikers, veterans, children, and community members, all brought together by one simple act of standing up for dignity and respect. "Tom would be proud," Harold said quietly, touching the photograph in the display case. "Not just of me, or you, Mike, but of all of this. This is what he fought for. People coming together, helping each other, carrying on the spirit of brotherhood." The diner erupted in applause, and outside, the sound of motorcycle engines revved in salute. A new kind of honor guard for a man who had taught them all the true meaning of respect.